One thing we saw last night, Myles, I want to hit on. A couple of things.
Mm-hmm.
One, Jaguars were putting together a nice drive at the start of overtime, working their way down the field. Impressive. C.J. Beathard overcoming what looked like a lingering hand-wrist problem that happened when he fumbled on one of his first snaps in, and you could see he kept going back to that the adrenaline wasn't taking over, and it makes me wonder, how's he going to be feeling today? If the adrenaline doesn't take over then, he's going to be feeling something in there today. But the great throw to Calvin Ridley that seemed to be the thing that was going to set up the game-winning touchdown. The holding penalty here. The broadcast was on board with it. Ryan Clark afterward was talking about how he thinks it wasn't a hold because the guy released. And, I look for some sort of restriction. And, yeah, you can hold, but there's a little that, you know what, now that I see it, it was enough. It was enough. And then the sales job was pretty impressive. But it was enough. It did restrict him. I'm fine with it. Look, I'm not going to use that as the latest piece of evidence that the officiating stinks and the function needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. That one's fine. But what bothers me about that, Myles, we see stuff like that happen all the time and not get called. They look the other way on it to help the quarterbacks. And the lack of consistency is what's troubling because it just underscores the broad discretion that the umpire and the referee have when they're stationed behind the action and they're watching that. We've seen that happen before and not get flagged. We see it happen all the time and not get flagged. There was a moment on Thursday night where Micah Parsons got tackled, for crying out loud, on his way to the quarterback, and there was no flag. We see it happen and not get flagged. And when it happens in that moment, that's when the tinfoil hat crowd says, they want the Bengals to win.
The tinfoil hat. Are you speaking for that community as a member of that community?
No. I fight that community. I fight that. My son is a card-carrying member of that community. He is convinced that everything about the NFL is rigged, top to bottom, inside out. He's worse than I am, if that's even possible. We get into arguments. We get into arguments like storm out the door arguments over whether or not it's rigged because my fallback position continues to be they're not competent enough to rig it. They're not. But he's convinced they want this team. They want that team. ESPN's controlling everything, he said. So maybe he has been listening to me a little bit too long.
Yeah, I think he.
Maybe I'm a bad influence.
Once you get to a certain age, and I just spent a week around my mom for Thanksgiving, you start to look at different things and mannerisms that your parents have, and then you kind of see those things in yourself, and you're like, oh, that's why I do that. So that's kind of where I would go in this particular thing where you're talking about card-carrying member of Tinfoil Hat Society.
So wait.
That's,
So are you saying when you call your mother, she's disappointed to hear your voice? Does she sound disappointed to hear voices too?
No.
Does Dr. Simmons not like to hear from her son?
I think that she does. And if she's listening right now, which typically she does, hello, mother, I love you very much. But I thought that was a hold to get back to the play. I thought that was a hold initially. I mean, when I'm watching it on television and I see that, I'm like, I think that that's a hold. And so when everybody starts celebrating because Calvin Ridley makes an outstanding catch, it's kind of like, well, let's see. And then they did call the hold, but you're also right in that things like that don't get called all the time, right? Just ask TJ Watt. Just ask Myles Garrett. Ask Micah Parsons, as you brought up. Aaron Donald is another one who gets held all the time. And it has to be particularly egregious when you hold those guys because you almost got to hold them every single play in order to block them, in order to neutralize them. So those are the things where I agree with you. It needs to be more consistent. That's exactly what Mike Vrabel said last year. If you're going to have different penalties and things like this, just make it as consistent as possible. So that way everybody knows what they need to teach during the week in practice, going all the way back to OTAs and then into training camp and all those different things so that you can have the proper techniques so that they're not going to get called and you're not going to get flagged.
I feel like this is further evidence that the NFL has slipped back into save the quarterback mode or save the clock tower mode, reference to a movie that Myles has never seen and will never see. But if this save the clock tower initiative is back in effect, it explains why you might have noticed on Sunday Lane Johnson once again doing the half-second early start into his pass block stance so he could deal with Nick Bosa and Chase Young. Jawan Taylor of the Chiefs lined up in the backfield again. You're noticing, because if you just watch the game, there's a rhythm to it. And if someone disrupts it early, you spot it. You just spot it.
You do.
Tackles leaving early again without the flags. Holding, they're looking the other way on holding to help the quarterbacks. That's what makes what happened last night so strange. Key moment of the game, the kind of hold that we see all the time uncalled, and there's the flag that wipes out the big throw, the 42-yard gain that would have put the Jaguars in position to potentially win the game with a walk-off touchdown on the first drive of overtime. The lack of consistency is problematic. And I think I said this yesterday, and it is speculation because they're never going to admit to this, but I believe, based on everything I know and everything I've seen and everything I've read and everything I've written and everything I've heard over the past 23 years, I believe that Roger Goodell said to somebody recently, we got to protect these quarterbacks. We got to protect them. We have to continue to have a very, very loose standard of what is intentional grounding. We need to let some holding happen if it protects the quarterbacks. We need to throw the flag on the sideline if a quarterback gets hit, even if he's not out of bounds, like Patrick Mahomes wasn't out of bounds on Sunday night. I just feel like as more and more quarterbacks get injured, there's a greater urgency to allow the things that tend to protect quarterbacks, Myles. That's what makes the hold last night head-scratching, because we're going to see more of those holds over the balance of the season that aren't called.
Well, right. And also, I mean, when you see another quarterback go down, especially for a contender in the AFC, it's kind of like, well, I understand why that is. And also, if you're Roger Goodell, you probably don't have to necessarily tell people, let's protect these quarterbacks. It's more or less, wouldn't it be better if we protected some of these quarterbacks, right? It's the whole who will rid me of this meddlesome priest thing once again, which I love whenever I can say, right? You don't necessarily have to be that direct about it, because you see all of these quarterbacks across the National Football League, all these starting quarterbacks are going out, and not all of them are because, the defense is so aggressive and it's this and it's that. I mean, last night with Trevor Lawrence, that's friendly fire, right? His tackle steps on him, and then because he steps on him, then Trevor Lawrence gets bit backwards as he is now on the ground. So these things happen. It's football. Injuries are going to happen. But I understand the impulse or the impetus or whatever you want to call it to say, hey, let's try to protect these dudes as much as we possibly can, because our product as a whole is not going to be as good if the best quarterbacks are not on the field. And, as we continue to see, that keeps happening across the National Football League.
Would it be considered irony if a quarterback gets injured by a tackle who started into his pass block set early in order to protect the quarterback from injury, and he started so early that he went back into the quarterback and stepped on his ankle and injured it? I think that would be ironic. Don't you think?
I think it would be too. Yes,
I
do. And not in Alanis Morissette way, in an actual ironic way.
No, the real way. Hi, it's Mike Florio. Thanks for watching PFT on YouTube. Hit subscribe for the latest news and analysis from Pro Football Talk.